All right, folks, here we go. Good to see you again, if virtually anyway. We're going to talk today about feminism and ethics. Let's go ahead and share my screen here. Got to make sure you can see my syllabus, which should be expanding here. Go back here and to see where we are. And try that again. Share screen. Why will it not show the actual syllabus? I don't know. But let's do that. And don't know if you can see it or not. It's always a little bit. Looks like you can, and when you're looking at the screen here. So let's make sure we can see this. So it should look like this. You can see we're down here, feminist ethics discussion for just one day later than the syllabus says. It's the 5th. And I'll put discussion 4 up there before I go to bed tonight, sometime after I'm done with this lecture. And it'll obviously be on the topic of this lecture. And you can see quiz 4 is coming up. And quiz 4 is only on a short block of material as well. So quiz 4 will actually just be on this stuff and a little bit on this Death Inc., which will not be a video lecture from me, but a video I will send you as is Flight from Death. Quiz 5 we'll have, in discussion 5, we'll have just to do with that film. So there's only a little bit coming up. I am going to put a final exam study guide up there probably tonight, and I'll send an announcement out about that as well. So you'll get that. You can see your final papers are due the 22nd. I'll open it up so you can turn them in sometime this week. They'll be up there. The papers are, again, their paper guidelines are up there on the WordPress site, just paper guidelines, but I'll also put them on Blackboard for us in the next couple of days. And your final exam, it says due the end of finals week. It'll be posted the first day of finals week, due the very last day of finals week. So I'll put the due date on it when I post it. So that's where we are. And let's go ahead and get to this video lecture, as it were. And so this PowerPoint, hopefully you can see it here, is called Feminism and Ethics. And hopefully it's nice and visible. Let's pull it up, and we'll just kind of go over it kind of quick. I'm going to send a couple other videos as I like to do on these issues. Whoops. And see what we can do here. Get the slideshow going. It always takes a moment because there's the bars. Give me a moment here. So let me just talk a little bit about feminism and ethics. I'm just going to talk about what feminism is and some of the major theories. And then I'm going to give you a little more to go on. So basically, when you are discussing feminism in philosophy, usually starts with the assumption, which is I think true, that most of philosophy, this area of philosophy that you're discussing, has been male biased and male dominated or male exclusive throughout most of its history, centuries, if not thousands of years. And we need to alter that. We need to include the female perspective. We need to include women. Women and men are different in various ways. And this can lead to important different perspectives. So the female voice has been neglected. It's time to listen to it. And this is true in ethics too. Ethics has been traditionally, in all areas of philosophy, the province of male writers, male thinkers, and possibly to the detriment of ethics, since we've neglected the voice of half the human race. That's basically what you do with your feminism and ethics. So first off, let's get a definition of feminism down. There are some people, some of you I'm sure, have negative stereotypes of feminism, and that's unfortunate. Those stereotypes might come from people you've known, who either have a negative view of feminist or claim they're feminist and they're a little weird. But we shouldn't let our negative stereotypes inform what feminism is. Look, feminism basically means, you can look this up in, say, Webster's Dictionary or the Oxford English Dictionary or a good encyclopedia, or any other number of credible sources. And the basic idea is that men and women are fundamentally equal. Not the same. Equal does not mean the same. Equal means of equal value. Women and men are equally important, equally valuable, should have all the same rights and freedoms. We should have equality before the law, equality in education, equality in all walks of life, meaning equal access, equal opportunity, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's all that feminism means. And if you think that through, I think everybody ought to be a feminist, right? Forget any stereotypes or negative connotations you have. Just work with that basic definition. And here it is, this is what a philosopher, I think, would put forward. Women and men should have equal moral, legal, political, and social status. That's the main claim. We live in a world that is biased in favor of males and sees things from a predominantly male perspective. That is still true. Beyond the scope of my talk today to prove that, but just do a little research and you'll see how obviously the world to this day, despite many decades of some pretty substantial improvements here and there, is still a world that is patriarchal, where men still have most of the major political positions. We still haven't had a female president, for example, in the United States, where most directors of movies are male, most award winners are male. Advertisements in certain films are always geared towards a male audience. I mean, you can do lots of research projects in lots of areas, and this would become quickly very, very obvious. Okay, so those are the first two claims of feminism, and the third is just quite simple. Justice requires that we fix it. We should combat patriarchy and work for a more equal society, a more egalitarian society. And again, equal doesn't mean interchangeable or the same. Equal just means equally important, equally valuable, ought to be given the same opportunities. Okay, so those are the basic claims of feminism. That's exactly how I'm going to understand it, and I'm not going to base my definition on any stereotypes. I'm just going to base my definition of it on the minimum here, the minimum definition. This is a good way of putting it. You may have seen this on buttons or bumper stickers or t-shirts. Feminism is the radical notion that women are people, and I think that just about gets it right. That is what feminism is at its core. Okay. Now, what you see here is something that was very common in ethics. A psychologist by the name of Lawrence Kohlberg wrote a book, 50s or 60s, somewhere around there. And Kohlberg wanted to talk about stages of moral development. Now, there are all kinds of objections to this. How do you know which stage is the highest? But as you can see here, Kohlberg ended up giving 6 stages of moral development. The very bottom, the lowest stage, small children are here. I obey the rules to avoid punishment. Stage 2, you obey the rules for like a gift or something. And then level 2, right? Level 1 is pre-conventional morality. Level 2 is conventional morality. Stage 3 is that orientation rule is a good boy, good girl. Orientation rules are obeyed for approval. And stage 4, maintenance of the social order. Rules are obeyed to maintain the social order. Morality of contract and individual rights. Rules are obeyed if they are impartial. And morality of conscience, big old ethical principles, stuff like Kant and Mill and these big theories that we've been learning. And Kohlberg found in his studies, and his studies have been rightly debunked, so don't take this as established, that men frequently made it to stage 5 and 6. Women far more often stopped somewhere in stage 3 or 4. Now, this had a lot to do with how Kohlberg and his researchers interpreted data and the kind of preconceptions they brought to it. But men and women and girls were traditionally in the 3 or 4. Were typically in the 3 to 4 area, and men 5 or 6. And since Kohlberg had made this a hierarchy, it seems that men were more, in general, men and boys were morally superior to women. Kohlberg didn't like this conclusion, but his research, he thought, suggested that it doesn't. The claim that morality of contract and individual rights and morality of conscience is above the stage 3 and 4 about maintaining healthy relationships, following your social roles, things like that. The idea that 5 and 6, when you flesh this out, are inherently superior is actually kind of a begging the question, right? It's an assumption. It's not something to be proved. So keep that in mind. So here is a very famous moral dilemma that Kohlberg would ask. And he had lots of these, and these are similar to cases in that book we would have used much more often when we were going to meet in person. Morality plays. You're asked to consider a certain ethical dilemma and see what you think. Now, this is his most famous one. It's called Heinz' dilemma. I'm going to play more about Mr. Heinz there in a second. So this is Kohlberg's moral dilemma, a Heinz dilemma, it's called. And typically men and women, boys and girls, Kohlberg found, in his day at least, answered this question a little differently. In Europe, a woman was near death from a rare kind of cancer. There was one drug doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He paid $400 for the radium and charged $4,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, tried every legal means. He's a law-abiding guy, but he could only get together about $2,000, which is about half of what it cost. Told the druggist that his wife was dying, asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later, but the druggist said, nah, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it. So, having tried every legal means, Heinz gets desperate and considers breaking into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. Should Heinz steal the drug? Why or why not? This, by the way, is part of your discussion that I'm going to assign tonight. You'll answer that question, should Heinz steal the drug? Why or why not? But you'll answer it with another consideration. So do remember this, right? Kohlberg's moral dilemma for your discussion will definitely also pop onto that quiz. But Heinz found Kohlberg found that men and women said, men and boys said, yes, he should steal the drug. His wife's life is worth more than money. He should steal the drug. So the men would typically make it a kind of calculation. Value of life is greater than the value of money. You should steal the drug. Women and girls gave more multifaceted and, from Kohlberg's perspective, ambiguous answers. They would try to find other solutions quite frequently. No, I mean, what if he goes to jail and then who's going to take care of his wife? They've got to find a way to talk this out. We've got to be able to change things. There's got to be a meeting of the minds here. And so there tended to be a difference. Now, Kohlberg tended to take the female answer and say, oh, it's lower on there. It's about maintaining relationships. That's 3 and 4. Or it's about keeping the peace. That's 3 and 4. Whereas the men are all about principles, and so they're 5 or 6. But there's a different and alternative reading of this, and this is what one of Kohlberg's students did. This woman is Carol Gilligan, and Carol Gilligan is an interesting thinker. Sometimes her claims go beyond her research, but that happens to the best of us. Still, she's introduced fantastic line of reasoning to ethical deliberation. In 1980s, I think it was 1982, she came out with this book you see here, In a Different Voice. And In a Different Voice took the studies that Kohlberg had done. He had studied with Kohlberg as a graduate student. Took the studies that Kohlberg had done and basically said his studies are fine, his interpretation is wrong. And the book has a lot of interesting things in it, but we're going to just focus on one. The case of Jake and Amy. Okay? So Jake and Amy are 2 kids. They're both 11 years old, and they're asked to consider a Heinz dilemma. See it here represented visually here. Should Heinz steal the drug? Well, Jake gives a characteristically male answer, according to Kohlberg's research. Yeah, a life's worth more than money. It's like a math problem with people, right? Life value, money value, life wins. Amy has a much harder time giving a direct answer and says, no, we've got to work something out that's best for everybody. Okay. And of course, Kohlberg puts Amy lower than Jake. Gilligan argues that that's not the case. Amy sees things in a more typically female perspective. Now, there's a lot of debate and a lot of subsequent research. This is really true that men and women think differently about ethics. That's debatable and debated. But Gilligan claims that they do. And it's not a matter of one being better than the other. It's just different, right? There's sort of a characteristically female way of thinking, and there's a characteristically male way of thinking. It's important to note that not all women will think like Amy. Not all boys or men will think like Jake. And there are people that are blurred in the middle somewhere. But typically, women and girls tend to answer more like Amy, and boys and men tend to answer more like Jake. Okay? Things like that. So here's what, after looking at a number of these cases, Gilligan says she finds in terms of differences among women and men. Women tend to think more in terms of personal relationships. Emotion and emotional connection matters as much as reason does. The primary virtue is to care and be cared for. Whereas men tend to think more in terms of abstract moral principles. Reason is all that matters. Emotion doesn't play much of a role. And contractual justice, I leave you alone, don't do certain things to you, you leave me alone, we'll give and take kind of thing is primary virtue. And it does seem that at least through a lot of Western history, that this does seem to fit the mold, that there are far more men that think this way and there are far more women that think this way. But of course, everybody thinks a little bit on both ways. And some women are over here in the men category and some men are more in the women category. But in general, right, women tend to think more this way and men tend to think more that way. And there's a lot of research that attempts to back this up. And that's a long story. I encourage you to do it on your own. But such is the claim. And Gilligan's other claim is that Western philosophy for the last several hundred years has focused solely on these masculine or male ways of thinking, neglecting these female ways. Okay. It is interesting to note that Aristotle's ethics, which I gave you a video lecture of previously, is actually closer to this. Aristotle, by some thinkers, has been jokingly called an honorary woman for having this perspective. Right? The virtue ethics of Aristotle is a bit more like what Gilligan calls the female perspective, although not entirely. There are still ways that Aristotle's over here, but it is a virtue ethic like Aristotle's is closer than say Kant or the libertarians or utilitarians. Whatever we think about how men and women differ, most of the moral theories we've learned, social contract theory, libertarianism, deontology, especially Kant, utilitarianism, are over here in the man aisle. And virtue theory is probably in between here, but leans a little more this way. But those are the differences. Are they differences? You decide. Do men and women really have these differences? I suspect a little bit. Whether that's nurture or nature, that's another debate. But I suspect a little bit. There's at least a little bit of truth to this, at least in many cultures, if not most cultures. I don't know about all, but certainly many are most. So, okay, let's dig in a little bit about this. Gilligan's claim is we've done things from a male point of view and we've neglected the female point of view. We have left out an important voice in the moral discussion. We need to include both, and we've only included the one. That's true for sure, right? We have done moral philosophy for hundreds of years, way more like this side than this side, and clearly we need both. And sometimes this is more important. Sometimes the male side here is more important than the female. But we've only had the male, so we've only had a half-assed ethics, right? That's not going to work. We need to listen to the other perspective. Well, one thinker who did that is this woman here. I believe she's still alive now, in her 90s. Nell Noddings, who came up with something called an ethics of care. It's not the only feminist ethics. There are many different ways to approach ethics in a feminist way, but it's one of the more famous theories. It's had a lot of influence, and I happen to think it's worth paying attention to. So Nell Noddings and the Ethics of Care. You can see her facts there. Nell Noddings, basically, here's what she asks: where does obligation come from? Traditionally, the philosophers we've studied have said, look, man, reason creates obligation. The reason that we get a sense of right or wrong is because reason tells us. Immanuel Kant's kind of the poster child for that. It is reason that tells me what is right and what is wrong. Morality is ultimately rational. And most of the thinkers we've looked at, the utilitarians think this, the social contract theorists think this. It's common view. But there is another view, and that is from this fun-loving Scotsman, and he was indeed apparently a cheerful, wonderful guy, David Hume. David Hume had argued for what we might call an emotionalism, that morality starts with feelings. So he says, look, if you see someone being murdered, for example, where's the wrongness of the murder? You can't reason it out. You feel it. You're horrified. You're disgusted. You're appalled. You're sad, something like that, right? So morality actually begins with our emotions. And so that's where you start, not reason. Right? Reason comes afterward. Whereas for most philosophers we study it's the other way around. Emotions need to be subordinated to reason. Hume thinks we ought to look at our best emotions and start there. Noddings agrees with that, by the way. Noddings agrees with Hume, but she adds another thing. 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, famous for that scowl and that wonderful mustache, added in well, Nietzsche's thought's kind of a mess, but there is one idea that's pretty clear. We all should be true to ourselves. Right? You must be true to yourself. Self-actualization and not conformity to some external and impersonal moral code is what being a good person is all about. Okay, self-actualization and not conformity to some external and impersonal moral code is what being a good person is about. Okay. Be the best you that you can be. Okay. But he doesn't say what that is. So what Noddings does is he puts Hume and Nietzsche together and says this: we have a natural sympathy or care for others in pain. That's where morality starts. That's what Hume thought. We care for each other. And in that care for each other, we want to help each other, and that's the origin of morality. But Noddings adds, we experience ourselves as self-actualized, at our best when we care for others. So since we have this drive, as Nietzsche thought, to be self-actualized, to be all we can be. So what we ought to do, if we feel ourselves as our best when we're caring for others, and we have a drive to be our best, then we should try to be as caring as possible. So we ought to expand our natural care, which comes naturally to those who are part of our group, as far as possible, and that is called ethical caring. So what Noddings is basically saying, look, you want to be the best you that you can be. You take your experience, wow, I really feel I'm at my best when I care for others, and you try to be as caring as possible. Here's how it works. So here's this young lady. She's trying to form an image of what a good person is, how to be a good person. She knows, and Hume knew this too, that caring for others feels good. It feels good to help other people. We naturally do have a drive to help others, although it's limited, right? It tends to be, we tend to make as human beings these in-group, out-group distinctions, but we realize we're all that we can be, and at our best, we have an image of our best self, Noddings says, an ethical ideal of what we are as a good person. She gets that from Nietzsche. And since we want to be the best we can be, and we experience ourselves at our best here, we expand it. And there we do, we care for others, all others, whether they're like us or not. Okay. And that is what, that is what morality is based on. And you'll see we'll flesh this out a little bit. We'll watch a video together, a short video in a moment. By the way, although we care as far as we can, Noddings says there are limits to care, and care is restricted. It's actually these concentric circles, I guess you call them, whatever it is, inner circles to outer circles. The closer someone is to you, the greater your obligation to care for them, and the further away, the less your obligation. So my family, my children, I would presume, because I helped create them and I'm responsible for them being here, my obligation to my family is very, very great. My friends, perhaps a little less. Extended family and friends, colleagues, neighbors. It goes out and out and out. And finally to strangers in our community. There can even be people we don't have an obligation to at all, says Nell Noddings. There can even be people we don't have an obligation to at all. Now that doesn't mean we can hurt them or harm them. It just means we're not obligated to go out our way to help them. It's just, imagine somebody starving in a far distant land. I am not morally obligated to feed them, to make sure that they are fed. I might be morally obligated to do nothing to contribute to harming them, but I'm not morally obligated to give money to feed them. They are way beyond my spheres of activity and influence. Not that it's not good, right? It's a good thing to help people in need wherever they may be, but I'm not obligated. If I decide to help someone in need who is out beyond my circles of care, that's supererogatory. A supererogatory means above and beyond. So let's test Noddings' theory with a couple of cases, and then we'll watch a video together. So the needy in the far reaches of the earth, that's the one I just mentioned. We are not obligated to help them. It's good to do so. She applauds those who do, but we don't have an obligation. It's not required. Okay. You might buy that. Here's another bit from Noddings. Animal rights. Noddings is not a vegan or a vegetarian and says we may raise animals for food and clothing. We may kill and eat them or kill and wear them. And that is because it's the established nature of our relationships. With our pets, we may not kill and eat them, and we have greater obligations because the social institutions surround us have created a social practice of certain animals being kept as pets and a certain relationship with pets. You don't eat your dog because society has set up your relationship with your dog in a particular way. It might be different in a different culture. But livestock is different. And this is an interesting dilemma. She's basically saying it's okay to eat meat, but not your dog. Now, I admit I feel that way myself, but rationally, that's kind of hard to flesh out. And here's a good test case. A bunny rabbit. A lot of people wear rabbit fur, and a lot of people eat rabbit stew or other dishes with bunny in it. I've had pet rabbits, and I couldn't bring myself to do that for sure. But some people have done both. They've had pet rabbits and ate rabbit. But rabbits, unlike dogs and cats, are still widely eaten, but also a very popular pet, and people love their rabbits. So this brings, is there really an objective difference between a pet, an animal for a pet, and an animal for food? Or is it just an emotional responses based in reason? As much as Notting's thinks emotion is really important and morality starts there, we have to be rational for Notting's too, and also for Hume. And are we being rational in this case? There are a couple other cases where you can test this. Abortion is a big one. Does a woman have a legal right to an abortion? Yeah, because her obligation to the baby depends upon the circumstances of her relationship to the pregnancy and so on. That's a long story, but basically the idea is, what is the relationship of a woman to, say, the early term fetus, the late term fetus? How did she get pregnant? Under what circumstances? This is kind of how it works. But I want to push this a little further. Let's look at a video together. And this video is from Crash Course, which I'm always fond of. And Crash Course, I'm going to take a minute to load. And here we go. Family obligations, Crash Course philosophy. Now you'll see how this relates. This is actually going to work into your discussion as well. So let's watch this.
When I first saw this product, I thought it looked kind of crazy. Didn't really understand what the benefits
We'll skip
would
the
be,
ad.
But I'd seen some before and after pictures on the website and thought to myself, you know what, I'm 48 years old. My face is starting to look a little bit aged. Wouldn't hurt to try.
There we go. It's the subtitles, just in case it's not loud enough.
For most of you, your parents brought you into this world. They also fed you and changed your diapers and wiped away your tears. They raised you. Yet, according to contemporary American philosopher Jane English, once you're grown, you don't owe your parents anything. Not a single thing. Now, this might sound a little selfish, a little ungrateful, a little mean, but let's hear her out, because you've learned by now that many of your default attitudes, the attitudes that you think you have about other beings and your relationships to them, have a hard time standing up to philosophical scrutiny. So let's scrutinize one of the most important relationships you have in your life, the one that you've had the longest and probably the most intimate one you'll ever have. Let's talk about your folks. There are three basic views about the obligations you have to your parents. One is the unconditional view. This is the view that simply by virtue of being your parent, that person is entitled to certain things from you. At a bare minimum, your presence and attention in their lives until one of you dies. By contrast, the conditional view says that you owe your parents based on what they gave you. So really terrible parents might not deserve anything from their grown children, but good parents deserve quite a lot. So your level of obligation is based on the amount of benefit that you received growing up. And finally, there's English's view, known as the friendship view. This says that you don't actually owe your parents anything once you've grown, regardless of how much you benefited from their parenting. Many of us take it as basic, that we owe our parents a lot, what with all of the feeding and nurturing and driving to soccer games and acting like they enjoy enjoyed our macaroni art. But English makes a couple of observations about this assumption. First, she says, if anything, it's the parents who owe their kids. After all, if you choose to have a child, you incur a huge responsibility to raise that child or to give it away to someone who will. So it's basically a contractarian relationship. If you agree to do something, then you have a duty to see it through or to extract yourself from the contract. And that is the line of reasoning that leads English to conclude that grown kids don't owe their parents back. Because none of us chose to be born, and you can't have an obligation if you didn't do something to incur that obligation. Now, you might be thinking, fine, if you want to think of family relationships in terms of contracts, then isn't there still an implicit contract between child and parent? If you've reaped the benefits of being raised by good, loving parents, doesn't it mean that you've implicitly accepted the contract and have therefore incurred obligations? The problem with that is children can't really enter into moral contracts. If, as an adult, you enter into an agreement with your parents, like you can live at home for free as long as you maintain your grades in college, then you got yourself a contract. But any benefits incurred while growing up don't count, because back when the relationship started, you were just a baby and you didn't have the rational capacity to be held to a moral contract. And what's more, your parents didn't provide for you with the expectation of a payout. They had you, or they kept you, or adopted you because they wanted you, and they gave to you because they wanted to. Good parents give unconditionally, so no matter how much you receive from them, you simply don't incur debt, because that's not how family works. Now, to be clear, English isn't giving us a pass to freeload off our parents. She thinks that if you have a good relationship with your parents, you'll probably want to help them out when you can, but that's not an obligation. Instead, she says, the appropriate model is friendship. Friends don't keep score, they help each other out of love, and in loving relationships, no one's keeping a hidden tally of who helped last and who's due to help next. You don't have to keep score. You give simply because you want to, out of love. So English argues that once you're an adult, your relationship with your parents should model that of friendship. And the thing about friends is, if the love isn't there, the friendship dissolves. You have no underlying obligation to remain friends with someone. And likewise, if you had bad parents, or if you simply don't care about them once you're an adult, you have no obligation to give them anything, including your time. You didn't incur a debt by being raised, she says. So just like with friendship, you can choose not to maintain a relationship with your parents. It's up to you. Now, this attitude might seem scandalous to some people. I mean, isn't blood thicker than water? Well, many philosophers challenge the idea that you have special obligations to someone just because you share some genetic material with them. By that logic, a person who was adopted at birth would have obligations to biological relatives that they've never met, and they wouldn't have any obligations to the family that raised them. And I think most of us can agree that that doesn't make any sense. We tend to think of adopted families as being no less familial than biological families. So if you think families are built through love and not blood, then it follows that families lacking in love can't make moral demands on its members because they simply don't have the standing. While we're talking about parents here, let's stop by the thought bubble for some flash philosophy. Before you're trusted to do something that has the potential to cause harm, you have to demonstrate that you can handle it. In most societies, this is done through licensing. Driver's licenses, hunting licenses, wedding licenses, heck, barbers even need to be certified before they can cut your hair. So contemporary American philosopher Hugh La Follette thinks that there's another group of people who should be licensed. Parents. That's right, La Follette thinks potential parents should be required to apply for and obtain a license before being permitted to reproduce. This sounds kind of ridiculous, right? But think about it. Most activities that require competence to do well, and that can cause harm if done badly, are regulated by society. There's no question that parenting isn't easy, and you can really mess up a kid if you do it badly. But right now, we wait until a parent has abused or neglected a child before the state intervenes. So La Follette asks, wouldn't it be better if we took preventative measures instead? After all, adoptive parents undergo heavy scrutiny before they get to have kids. So just like driving a car in La Follette's plan, you'd have to pass a test before you could get a parenting license. There'd be classes for those who need it, and you can always reapply. But if you can't demonstrate a basic ability to raise a child, then you just don't get to have one. What do you think? Would society be better or worse if you needed a license to raise children? Does everyone have the right to be a parent, or should you have to demonstrate that you're up to the task before you're allowed to bring a new human being into the world? Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, here's yet another perspective on the philosophy of family obligations. Contemporary American philosopher Claudia Mills argues that there's something truly special about what you have with your family. Your family members are the only people in your life that are permanent and unchosen, she says. And because of that, there's value in maintaining a connection with them. Mills points out that we live in a world where we're constantly changing. Most of us will have many different jobs and live in lots of different places and go through a great many friends, maybe even a couple of spouses. But there will come a time when there are very few people left in your life who have known you since the beginning. Mills thinks that your family allows you to stay connected to the person you once were before all those changes happened. And even if you aren't really that person anymore, that connection can be grounding and valuable. So go ahead, call your brother on his birthday. Remind him of the time he tried to dry his socks in a frying pan. In addition to getting a good laugh out of it, your brother might appreciate reconnecting with his roots. Now, you might have noticed this is the first time our discussion of ethics has focused on personal individual connections, on feelings of love rather than on impartiality. This is a characteristic of a school of moral thought known as the ethics of care. Contrary to
Okay, so before I play the rest of this video, I'm also going to play the next one in this series. So, a few more minutes for you. After that, this is where he introduces the ethics of care. That is Nell nodding. So he used personal relationships and the nature of the family to introduce us to this particular topic, which seems like a good idea to me. Now we're at the part that is relevant to what I've just been discussing, the ethics of care and how obligation arises according to that theory. A little bit more in this video, a little bit more in the next video.
most of the theories we've studied, this view says that morality demands that we pay attention to special relationships we have in our lives. The ethics of care says that morality goes wrong when we emphasize impartiality, because it's our most caring relationships that make our lives worthwhile. And we want our friends and family to care more for us than they do for strangers, right? So ethicists of care often reason that even though we might have a general love for humanity itself, you just can't beat the unconditional, I would literally die for you love that we only have for the people we know best, the ones with whom we share an intimacy that we simply can't feel with strangers. What could the harm be in that? Well, many ethicists worry that showing preference for the people that you happen to like opens the door for prejudice, because it's easy to be kind to people you like. You don't need morality to tell you that. The hard part is being kind to people you don't like, or who are different from you, or who you simply don't know or understand very well. It would be great if everyone had a support network of people who love them, so we'd just all take care of our own loved ones and life would be perfect. The problem is there are a lot of people who aren't lucky enough to have support networks of care. And there are others who have people who care about them, but their loved ones lack the resources to actually provide for them. If we rely on ethics of care, it looks like those people will get neglected. So we're going to talk about this next time when we discuss poverty and the moral obligations we have to strangers in need. But today we talk.
Here we go. Let's discuss that right now, after we skip another ad. What are you going to do?
UNICEF estimates that 12 children who live in extreme poverty die every minute of every day. They die because they don't have access to clean water. They die because they don't have enough to eat. They die of malaria or of intestinal worms, something we don't even let our pets suffer from. It's a horrifying truth, and what's maybe even more horrifying is that these deaths are easily preventable. For $3, a child could get a mosquito net for her bed that would protect her from malaria. To cure her of intestinal worms, a dose of medicine costs less than 50 cents. As for food, you could probably feed her with the loose change in your pocket. We have this money. I definitely have it. You probably do. So why are all of these children dying? The United States is an affluent country. We have enough money to easily stop world poverty. Just end it. But why should we? Why should I give any of my hard-earned money to strangers I will never meet? What entitles them to a portion of what I have? Thinking about world poverty and whether we have an obligation to do something to stop it really comes down to questions of obligation. Most of us don't know anyone who's living in extreme, life-threatening poverty. The victims of that kind of poverty aren't our family or our friends. So according to an ethics of care, as we discussed last time, we have no real obligation to those people. Or if we do, it's much, much less than the obligation we have to those who are near and dear to us. So many people argue that we simply don't have any obligation to help strangers in need. We didn't make them poor and we never agreed to help them. So if we do choose to help, that's great, but such actions are supererogatory. They go above and beyond the call of moral moral duty. In this view, giving money to charity is like getting moral extra credit. If you do it, you can go ahead and pat yourself on the back, but if you don't, you have no reason to feel bad about it. Contemporary Australian philosopher Peter Singer thinks differently, however. To see how, let's head over to the thought bubble for some flash philosophy. Singer offers a thought experiment that has seen many variations over the years, but a basic version goes like this. Imagine you're walking to class feeling pretty good about how great you look in your brand new $200 shoes, and soon you pass by a shallow pond. Suddenly, you notice a small child flailing in the water. No one else is around. The pond is shallow, but the child has lost her footing and she can't get her head above water. As you watch the flailing stops, you realize there's very little time. You could easily wade into the water and pull her to safety, but if you take the time to remove your shoes, it'll be too late. You know the muddy water will ruin your new purchase. So what do you do? Singer's pretty sure that we'd all give the same answer. Shoes are replaceable. That child's life is not. So none of us would think twice about running in to save her. But what exactly would be wrong if you decided not to save the child? Singer says it comes down to costs and benefits. The cost of your shoes is so low compared to the value of the child's life that it would be appalling not to make that sacrifice, to value shoes over a person's life. But here's the thing. We know children are dying right now, 12 every minute, and yet we do nothing. So what's the difference, Singer asks, between a life in front of us and a life halfway around the world? A life is a life, and both the child in the pond and a child dying of malaria are equally innocent. If we do wrong in failing to save the child in the pond, Singer argues we do equally wrong in failing to save some of those children who we know are dying right now. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Singer argues that if you can prevent great harm at a little cost to yourself, you should do it. And when you look at it like that, it's hard to disagree with him. But his thought experiment points out some huge inconsistencies in our moral thinking. Most of us don't feel the weight of obligation to help dying children we can't see, but at the same time, we think we would have an obligation to help a dying child right in front of us. What does it matter whether we can see the child or not? Some people argue the difference is that in the thought experiment, there's no one else around. You're the only one who can help, so you must. But what if there were many people standing around the pond, but no one else was willing to save the child? Would that make your inaction more excusable? Why would it? Singer argues that it doesn't matter what everyone else is doing. You are in control of you and of your actions. So if you see a need and you know you can help, you must, even if there are others who could but don't. Now, is it fair for you to have to bear the burden of helping while others sit idly by? No, it's not fair at all. But fair doesn't really matter in this case. What matters is whether or not you choose to take action to prevent great harm at little cost to yourself. Whether you alone watch the child drown or you and a crowd of people watch her drown, either way, you failed spectacularly as a moral agent. And Singer says the same goes for world poverty. If everyone in America donated just 1% of their income to help people in extreme poverty, we could save so many lives. Now, we know that everyone isn't going to do that, but according to Singer, each of us is responsible for our failure to help, regardless of what everyone else is doing. Now, 20th century American philosopher and ecologist Garrett Hardin took issue with much of Singer's reasoning. Instead, he offered what's known as the lifeboat analogy. Imagine, Hardin said, that 50 people are on a lifeboat with room for 10 more, and 100 people are in the water begging to be let aboard. Hardin said that if we understand that all life is equally valuable, then we have to admit all 100 of them. But of course, that would be too many for the boat. It would sink, and then we'd all die. So maybe we only allow 10 people on board. But which 10? How do we make that decision? But even if we had some way to choose between lives, Hardin argued that filling our boat to capacity is still the wrong answer. By leaving those 10 spaces empty, we'd have more resources for those on board, maximizing their chances of survival. Those people in the water are doomed, Hardin said. They're doomed because they don't have a boat, and they need a boat of their own if they're going to make it. Helping a few of them out doesn't really solve any problems. If anything, it draws out their suffering. Okay, here's the thing about this analogy. The lucky people in the lifeboat, Hardin said, that's a nation. And the people in the water, they're other nations. Ones living in such extreme poverty that they don't have their own boats. The boat, in this case, represents a strong social structure, a safety net that provides for its citizens. Hardin said that just as the duty of a ship captain is to its passengers, a nation's obligations are to its citizens. So a nation should never risk the well-being of its citizenry in order to help members of another nation. Of course, some nations don't have the resources to help their citizens. In others, people live under governments that are actively exploiting them rather than protecting them. But Hardin said that's not our fault, and to give aid to people who don't even have a boat, well, that's throwing away resources. Who cares if your mosquito net saves a child from malaria when that child will still be living in inescapable poverty? The real problem, according to Hardin, is overpopulation. And the hard truth is, if a nation has more citizens than it can support, just like a lifeboat that's filled beyond capacity, no amount of aid will solve that problem. So quite counterintuitively, Hardin said the most compassionate response is to do nothing. Yes, people will die, but if aid were to stop, Hardin said, populations would be reduced to a point where nations would be able to sustain themselves. Now, there are at least two pretty immediate responses to this line of thinking. First, the lifeboat analogy breaks down when you realize that the problem really has nothing to do with the scarcity of resources. In the real world, there are plenty of resources to go around, they're just distributed extremely unevenly. So it seems that Hardin has committed what's known as the either-or fallacy. He said either protect yourself or help others, but with the amount of wealth we have, we could actually and easily do both. Second, Hardin cast his analogy in terms of nations, but that scale is totally arbitrary. Any argument you could give for caring about your nation over others could also be given for caring about your state over others, or your city, or even your family. And you might say, darn right, I care about my family more than yours, but be careful, because isn't that just like arguing that you only have to pull that kid out of the water if she happens to be related to you? Morality calls for us to not draw arbitrary lines when it comes to who deserves help and who doesn't. A lot of people, like Singer, think that the only non-arbitrary line is to say that there's really only one boat, and we're all in it, so we've all got to help. Everyone. So what do you think? Are you in your own boat? One thing that might help you answer that question is the topic of our next and next to last lesson, the value of human life.
Also an interesting discussion, but one we're not getting into here. It's just the death and the value of life. But this gives you a little bit. There's a lot there, so don't worry if you got it all. You can always rewatch these videos. You can see their Crash Course Philosophy number 43 and 44. So you can always rewatch them. But for our purposes, I want to keep Peter Singer in mind versus Nell Noddings, and I want to keep Heinz Dilemma in mind, which we will do in the discussion. But for Peter Singer versus Nell Noddings, remember, Noddings is basically saying we do not have an obligation to needy people in far-off lands. Our obligations start primarily with those closest to us and gradually diminish the further someone is from our circles of care, the less close the relationship. And those people we don't have a relationship with, so we're not obligated to help them, although it's a wonderful thing if you do. It's not obligatory. It is, again, supererogatory or above and beyond. Singer thinks that's not true based on the analogy that he gives there. That, look, if you have the resources to save someone in need and you don't, you have acted immorally. It's just like the kid's drowning. You won't waste your $200 shoes. You'd be a monster. But you still buy $200 shoes. You can give that $200 to UNICEF or some other wonderful organization like Oxfam and help a starving kid or a kid in need of a vaccine. That's the Singer argument. So I'm going to put those together and kind of give you your discussion based on that. And we'll see how you do with it. All right. So we'll be in touch again soon. I hope everybody's safe and I hope everybody's well. And again, look for a new discussion posted tonight. Your final exam study guide posted soon, and so on. All right, I will talk to you soon, and that'll do it for this round.